Welcome to episode 69 of The Place of Sound. It's been a while. I'm Vincent Andrisani, and you haven't heard my voice on an episode of this show for some time. But I'm back for the next couple episodes because we're bringing you something a little out of the ordinary. Typically, you'd be hearing the voice of our excellent host, Natalie Hall, and listening to work produced by students in the Communication and Media Studies program. Instead, you'll be listening to an interview I recently conducted with Dr. Kate Lacey, an expert in the field of media studies and radio history. Dr. Lacey is a professor of media history and theory in the School of Media, Arts, and Humanities at the University of Sussex. She convenes the university's MA program in Media and Cultural Studies and has taught a range of courses across both the MA and BA programs. She also supervises students at both the MA and PhD level. Her work grows out of an interest in German history, and alongside the dozens of journal articles she's published, she's also authored 2 books of media history. The first is titled Feminine Frequencies, Gender, German Radio, and the Public Sphere, 1923 to 1945. This was published by University of Michigan Press in 1996. And the second is titled Listening Publics, The Politics and Experience of Listening in the Media Age. This was published by Polity Press in 2013. It's this second book that forms the basis of the conversation you'll hear today. But first, a little bit of context. In the winter semester of 2024, I delivered a graduate level course titled Sound Studies in the Communication and Media Studies graduate program at Carleton University. During that course, we read Listening Publics in its entirety. And as we went through the text, students took note of the questions they'd like to ask Dr. Lacey if they had the opportunity to do so. So they compiled those questions, and in this interview, I had the opportunity to ask them on their behalf. I've been following her work for some time, and it's been hugely influential on my own thinking. In addition to the valuable histories of media it tells, it also helps us connect the dots between media, listening, and democratic participation, ideas that are at the heart of the media environments we inhabit today. So I'd like to extend a heartfelt thanks to Dr. Lacey for generously offering her time to have this conversation and for so willingly responding to student questions about her work. You'll hear part 1 of the interview in this episode, episode 69, and the second half will be aired in the next episode, episode 70. Enjoy.
My background is as a Germanist. So my first degree was in German and politics. And then I did a PhD in history. So I came into academic life as a German historian. And I wrote a book about, as you just mentioned, feminine frequencies, gender, German radio, and the public sphere, 1923 to 1945, to give it its full title, which was really, I was interested in a particular moment where radio emerges as a mass medium for the first time. In fact, I think mass media, in a sense, emerged interestingly for the first time in the 20th century, at the same moment when women were entering into the public sphere. So I was really coming at it as a feminist historian, and the fact that I was writing about media was kind of secondary. But then in the UK at the time, there weren't many jobs in German departments or whatever, so I ended up getting a job in a media department. So I found myself teaching media studies, and within that, film theory. And I was just really struck, as the more I taught about film theory, that there was so much that was written about spectatorship, about the gaze, about all of these, about visual pleasures and so on and so forth. And it really struck me that, as something by then of a radio specialist, that we didn't really talk about listening in the same kind of way. It wasn't theorized in any interesting way. We would talk about listeners, we would talk about listening figures, but really there was no language or theory to think about it. So that's where it sort of began. It was a sort of ambition to do for radio studies, I suppose, what had already been done in film studies for the idea of spectatorship and indeed for readership in relation to English studies. So that's kind of where it began, and then the book itself is that kind of mix of history and theory, which is, I think, what I can bring to the table. I'm neither just a theorist nor am I just a historian. I like to mix the two up. So
yeah, I think that's the reason. What I was saying a second ago, that's the reason why the book resonates with media studies students who, to be quite frank, when they sit in a sound studies class, they need a little bit of convincing. Why sound studies? Like, why are we doing? Like, why are we dedicated? Why aren't we talking about just media? Like, what is it about a dedicated study of audio media that's going to bring me into sort of this new understanding of what media are? And this book does that. It speaks the language. Strangely, I mean, you don't fancy yourself maybe as a media studies scholar.
Oh, definitely media studies. Just so I'm ambivalent. That's not right. That sounds a bit more rude than I mean it to. But so I'm not sound studies. I'm certainly sort of media and communication studies these days. But with this background as a historian.
Yeah. Right on. So this kind of speaks to sort of how you arrived at the book, and then there were a series of questions about the book itself that students were keen on. This idea of listening, as you say, is at the center of them. Being able to kind of dig into the idea of listening as a theory is something that was new to them, and so. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that listening kind of gets framed in the book, the way that you're thinking about listening is that it consists of several sort of key features or characteristics. It's historical. It's conditioned by the technologies we use. It's embodied. It's a sort of social, but also physiological sort of disposition. It's voluntary. We can do it. We can turn it off and on, presumably, and maybe some varying degrees between. And it's political. Yes. It gets framed ultimately as a sort of responsibility of the citizen. So I guess the question is this accurate? Is this sort of treatment of listening missing anything? And how do you view it?
Yeah, I've taken notes. That was a very nice summary of the different ways in which I think it does appear. So that's very handy. I mean, I suppose I began by looking to see where one would expect to find listening in the histories of media or theorizations of communication and so on, and really not finding it very often, or just glossed over, or just implied. So it's a bit like thinking about how we think about when we go and see a film or we watch television. We also, obviously, these days also listen to it, but we just assume that. We don't say it out loud. We don't really pay it attention. So this is why having, some of the book is about trying to restore the history of mediated listening to our histories of media. But in so doing, it kind of also then exposes a lot of the assumptions that we work with when we're thinking about and engaging with the media. So actually listening then becomes a category of analysis as much as it is, something that we do in the world and I'm simply writing about. I think I'm also trying to write with the idea of listening. And listening then, takes you into thinking about the sonic. And again, I'm interested in the way in which sonic metaphors or sonic language, or language that is sensitive to the sonic, is another way of, excuse the pun, sort of looking differently at the way in which we theorize our communication. But I would say that I want then to use listening not only to refer to what happens in sound, I want listening to be a kind of way of talking about reception and engagement in communication in the same way that we would use reading. that we often say we can read a text. We talk about all different forms of media, whether or not they're sort of they employ writing. We talk about being able to read a film, read a podcast, I suppose. And actually, I think once you start to think about listening as a category, and what happens if you were to translate all those times we talk about reading into listening, what do we gain, or what assumptions are made evident? Which I can talk a bit more about if you want to.
I would be happy to hear you talk more about that. Yeah, that would be excellent.
Because I know there was a question I think your students were interested in about the relationship to reading.
That's exactly what I was thinking. You're right.
And I don't want to collapse the difference at all. But it did strike me that a useful way of thinking about reading was as a sort of sublimated listening. So thinking particularly about the invention of writing, particularly the phonic alphabet, and thinking about that almost as the first form of sound recording. So it's a way in which we have been able to record and document speech. Then that becomes a way of thinking about listening as a kind of as like the form, the sort of original form of reception and writing and reading is a way of documenting speech, speaking and listening. So listening, then I think what happens is what it brings back to the table, if you start thinking about it in those more generic terms, is things to do with liveness, with contemporaneity, with communication that's happening in the moment. It brings back embodiment. I mean, reading and writing specifically since the age of print has been a very abstracted kind of communication. It brings back the vernacular, so I think there's a democratizing element to it, and I think it brings back the intersubjective, because so rarely do we actually listen alone, particularly in mediated situations, but actually also in interpersonal situations. Other than a one-on-one, you're most likely to be listening with another person while one voice at a time tends to speak. So there's something about the collectivity, the intersubjectivity, that I think the idea of listening brings to questions of communication and politics and so on.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, one of the other key contributions of the book, as you mentioned, is the historical work that it does, and particularly as it pertains to the role of radio and the rise of Nazism. And so, can you say a little bit? Maybe can you speak to that idea a little bit about what your research suggests in terms of the relationship between radio listening, and the rise of the Third Reich? There seems to be a sort of popular understanding the radio produced Hitler, and so I wonder maybe if you can just share a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think both the Nazis, and they share a very widespread assumption that listening is passive. That the listening public, if we want to call it that, or the radio audience at least, is both passive and gullible. That the mass is uniform, can be uniformly targeted, and that the message will be absorbed and reproduced and so on. I mean, that is the classic sort of hypodermic model of messaging and so on. And so there's a certain kind of that's certainly at the heart of where they begin with in terms of their propaganda. But having said that, I think strangely, obviously you have to look earlier than 1933, which is when the Nazis come to power, to understand how they came to be in a position where they could actually be voted into power as they were. And in relation to the radio at the time, which was among the most sort of, I mean, Weimar Republic had one of the most liberal constitutions of the era in terms of protections of freedom of speech and rights of women to vote and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, it was born out of extreme political polarization. So with the communists on the one hand and the rising fascists on the other, and this new medium, this new space of the radio, knowing that it was kind of indiscriminate in its address, that it was supposed to be, in principle, listened to by everybody within the nation. There was a real anxiety about exacerbating that polarization from the people who were in charge. And so they excluded the Nazis and the far left wing from the airwaves, which I think is, really resonant for what we're going through right now in terms of the idea of cancel culture and so on. Because actually what it did was to sort of alienate and separate out from the conversation the whole range of voices that could have been heard and should have been heard. So they had a policy of non-political radio, which of course in itself is already a political gesture, a political move. The other thing I just thought of that's kind of interesting to think about is that in that moment, that both listeners on the left wing, so trade unions and members of the Communist Party, members of the Social Democratic Party and so on the one side, and members of the nascent sort of Nazi Party on the other side, would organise collective listening groups to listen to the radio and engage in critique so that they could then, counter this bland, middle of the road kind of stuff that was being put out there. And I think it's really interesting to see that the response on either side was very similar. And of course, the Nazis come into power, and those listening groups become, in the vanguard of a much more draconian and surveillance culture of actually, imprisoning and threatening with the death penalty, listening radio to voices that were from outside, alternative or underground voices. So it's kind of, I don't know if that's really answered the question. I mean, I think that the radio plays a part in the rise of fascism. It plays a part in obviously through the period of the Third Reich itself. But I don't think it's as powerful as it's the stereotype would suggest. So, for example, at the end of the Feminine Frequencies book, I was interested in looking at, there's a scholar of BBC history, Paddy Scannell, who writes a lot about the democratizing potential of public service broadcasting, admittedly within a democratic framework. But the things that he talks about, saying for the first time you have a sense of a national community listening in real time. You have a sense of a mixed program of different genres, of different kinds of people listening together and so on and so forth. Went through all of his categories, and every single one of them was also true of Nazi radio. So you could argue that either he got it entirely wrong, or that, in fact, the form of radio does carry with it some kind of democratizing potential, and that might help explain some of the limitations of Nazi propaganda. Nazi propaganda, they had control of all outlets, followed up by very draconian sanctions, and yet still not everybody signed up for the Nazi Party. Not everybody in Germany, was a fully fledged fascist. So there were still spaces for resistance, spaces, of different levels and so on. So it kind of helps to explain possibly that there was still something, a sort of, a good version of that communality, despite the content. I don't know how far I want to go in really making that argument, but it's a thought experiment anyway.
Yeah, excellent. Wow, that's excellent. That's a great treatment. Thank you. And one of the more fascinating parts of that history that captured my imagination the first time I went through it, and also the students, was the idea of listening groups as filters, as ways of vetting listening content and listening material. And that was news. That was news to many people in the room. It was news to me when I encountered it at first as well. Mm-hmm. Right. The maybe more widespread suspicion of this new medium, and the idea that we need to discuss this. Let's get together. Let's make sure nothing slips through the cracks. Right. So yeah, Fabulous. Thank you.
Well, I also think it's to do with the dominance of that idea of a mid 20th century model of broadcasting, which we think is now, collapsing because of podcasting and microcasting and all the rest of it. But we forget that we've sort of imposed that model on what happened. It was much more messy. There were lots of different forms of reception, lots of different spaces in which radio and television were consumed. At the beginning, radio was a one-to-one medium and not precisely a broadcasting medium. So we kind of forget we've written out those histories, and so it's again it's just a different way of being more nuanced about the history, but also then it helps you rethink what might be going on now as not is so entirely new.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So one point that students often grapple with when they read through your work is the idea, and in part it's maybe because they're not terribly familiar with the idea of the public, like maybe Michael Warner's work, but the point that you sort of it's a really strong point of differentiation that you make, which is between listening audiences and listening publics. That the idea that the latter can emerge sort of in the context of the former, but it's not analogous to it. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe iron out my thinking. Is there any way maybe you can say a little bit more about the differences between the concepts of the listening audience and the listening public?
I think you're right. They're different concepts, but they're the same thing. So they're describing the same thing. It's a different way of coming at the collection of people who happen to have the facility to listen and listen to mediated content. I suppose the difference would be that the audience is produced by the program, or whatever we want to call it. That it's produced in response to something. That's conventionally how everybody thinks of it. That's what we're talking about when we talk about listening figures and all the rest of it. For me, the listening public comes first. The listening public is there regardless of the program. It produces the program. So it's the idea that there might be people coming to listen to this podcast, which is making us talk. It's not, conventionally it would be like we've had this talk and people will come to listen to it. But actually it's the latent public that is in principle or in theory listening out for something to listen to, that is producing this exchange or producing any kind of talk. So I suppose that would be one of the differences. I think but actually it's sort of simpler than that as well. It's recognizing that we use the word audiences in media studies for all sorts of different things, apart from readers for some reason. And actually for internet users as well, we tend not to talk about internet audiences so much. But anyway, we talk about the audience without ever really noticing the audio bit of that word. The fact that it is fundamentally about a listening position. So at one level, it's as simple as that, just to say, well, what happens if we focus on these people as listeners and as a public? Because again, within media studies or political and audience theory, the difference between audience and public is pretty much a political one. It's about whether you think of them as active or passive.
Right. Thank you.
I think.
Yeah. One of the and I'm sorry for kind of jumping around from question to question. I want to make sure everyone's questions get as many questions as we can get addressed. One of the students in the class had a background in photography, visual culture studies. She's doing visual culture studies, and she had a background also in visual design. And she was particularly attracted to the concept of radiogenics. So that's where the question of radiogenics came from. Since, of course, it plays off the idea of photogenics, which you talk about in the book. Can you talk a little bit more about the concept? Say, where does it come from? Is it your own? I personally don't know it. Or is it part of like radio studies? Is that something that gets used quite often in radio studies? And do you continue to use it in your work?
it's not my invention, but when I started writing about it, it was hard to find. It's more like an idea that is very, very common and widespread and gets described in different kinds of ways. But because the idea of the photogenic is kind of common, the idea of the radiogenic seemed like as good a umbrella term as any. But just for thinking about those ways in which artists and journalists and radio producers in general and audiences were interested in this idea that a particular kind of medium has certain kind of essential characteristics that are best served by particular kinds of aesthetics. And at one level, I've said enough to show that is kind of nonsensical, because there's nothing essential about any of it. It's historically contingent. It's a strange sort of nexus of the affordances of the technology meeting, historically changing taste cultures and politics and all the rest of it. So at one level, I'm not particularly interested in the idea of the radiogenic. I'm interested in how often it surfaces and how it surfaces differently within different contexts. So again, going back to the Nazis, thinking about what the Nazi idea of what made good radio might be very different to different radio producers in different times and places. I mean, you can see it going on now with endless discussions about what makes a good podcast. And something I'm working on at the moment is about the way in which so much that's written about podcasting at the moment is about intimacy. And this notion that there's something kind of essentially intimate about the podcast form, which I find very odd and kind of faintly problematic, but also doesn't kind of acknowledge the history of intimacy in many different kinds of mediated forms of communication as well. So yeah, the idea that any kind of media form carries with it as something which is essentially radio or essentially filmic or something, I think it's an interesting discussion, but I don't think there is something at the heart of it that you could keep looking for and you would ultimately find it. I mean, the fact that radio doesn't have pictures is kind of key. So how do you evoke images? But it's so often talked about in terms of a lack. How does radio make up for the fact that you can't see the people who are speaking or acting or playing the music or whatever else? But there's not that many. I mean, it doesn't seem to be a problem when people are reading literature. It's not the be all and end all about whether you can whether the lack of the image. We don't all have picture books the whole time. So it seems it's very often described in terms of lacks and disabilities, almost the blind medium and so on, which I find kind of problematic as well.
I hate to have to end things so abruptly, but that's all the time we have for this episode. But as promised, the second half of my interview with Dr. Kate Lacey can be heard on the next episode of The Place of Sound, episode 70. Stay tuned for that one, which will go live in a couple of weeks. Until next time, happy listening.